You walk through the corridors of Nero's golden house. The marble under your feet gleams like wet bone, and every torchlight ripple seems to move of its own accord. The air smells of roses and smoke, the scent of morning disguised as perfume. Somewhere beyond the echoing halls, a man is laughing softly to himself, and it takes you a moment to realize there is no one else there. Before we descend further into this story, into the grief, the madness, and the transformation of an emperor, take a moment to join our growing circle of curious minds. If you find meaning in peeling back the layers of history's darkest corners, consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this one. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It's a strange comfort to know that from Rome to Rio, Karachi to Kyoto, we're all connected by our fascination with how power and obsession shape the human soul. When Nero Claudius Caesar stepped into power at 16, he was everything Rome had hoped for. A new dawn after the long shadows of imperial brutality. He reduced taxes, opened the theaters, and sang for the people in the open air. His reign began like a performance of renewal. Golden youth wrapped in laurel leaves, his mother Agrippina beaming beside him, the senators whispering that maybe, just maybe, the empire had found a benevolent god in mortal form. But power has a way of asking for a sacrifice. And Nero's came in the form of a woman named Poppaea Sabina. She was grace carved in living flesh, intelligent, ambitious, her laughter sharp enough to draw blood. She knew her worth, and in a city that worshipped beauty, she learned quickly that beauty could command empires. When Nero met her, he was already bound by duty to Octavia, the quiet daughter of a former emperor. Octavia was Rome's idea of virtue, dutiful, restrained, and utterly invisible to him. Poppaea was different. She spoke in riddles of affection, challenged him in front of the Senate, and once dared to mock one of his songs. Instead of angering him, it inflamed something deep within. To Nero, her defiance was not disrespect. It was proof that she saw him as a man, not a god. Soon, the emperor's devotion became something darker than love. He built shrines of ivory for her, placed guards at her doors, and gifted her jewels worth the annual revenue of entire provinces. Courtiers began to notice the change. Nero, once vibrant and public, now withdrew into her orbit entirely. And then, one evening in 65 AD, the palace erupted in screams. Ancient historians disagree on the exact cause, perhaps a drunken argument, perhaps jealousy. But they all agree on the end. Poppaea, pregnant with Nero's child, fell beneath his rage. One blow, they said. A single kick, the sound of gold bracelets clattering on marble. When the silence fell, so did Rome's illusion of its golden prince. Nero's grief was not human. It was imperial. Absolute, theatrical, consuming. He refused to burn her body according to custom. Instead, he had her embalmed in spices from Arabia and laid in a sarcophagus carved from translucent alabaster. For weeks he slept beside the tomb, whispering to her, offering food and flowers as though she might wake. He issued decrees declaring her divine, forcing the Senate to honor her as a goddess. At dinner, courtiers were required to pour wine in her name. At festivals, bards sang to the empress who was no longer alive. The palace became a mausoleum of denial. Servants were ordered to speak to empty rooms as if she stood within them. Musicians played her favorite melodies to silence. Nero wandered the halls draped in white, eyes ringed with sleepless devotion, murmuring that she would soon return. "She visits me in dreams," he told his tutor Seneca, voice trembling like a child's. "She forgives me. She will come back." At first, the court obeyed out of fear. Then they obeyed out of horror, because there were nights, terrible nights, when they swore they saw her shadow moving against the wall, or caught the faint trace of her perfume in the garden breeze, long after the tomb had been sealed. In this fevered state, Nero began to reshape the world to fit his delusion. He commissioned artists to carve new statues of Poppaea, each more lifelike than the last, and demanded that one stand in every major city of the empire. "She is not gone," he told them. "She is watching." He surrounded himself with mirrors polished so bright that he could almost imagine her face flickering back at him. But grief left him unsatisfied. Statues could not sing. Paintings could not smile. He needed more than remembrance. He needed replacement. And that hunger began to twist into something unspeakable. One evening, during a routine inspection of the palace staff, Nero's gaze fell upon a young freedman, a quiet boy assigned to administrative duties. His name was Sporus. Barely 15, slight in build with soft features and pale skin untouched by the sun. When he bowed, the torchlight caught his face just so, and the emperor froze. Witnesses later said it was as if he'd seen an apparition. Nero stepped closer, studying the boy's eyes, the curve of his lips, the delicate slope of his neck. The resemblance was uncanny. He reached out, not to touch, but to trace the air before him, whispering a single word: "Sabina." That night, Nero summoned his closest physician and spoke a command no one dared repeat. The emperor had loved a woman he could not bring back from death, but perhaps, through the living, he could recreate what the gods had taken. And in that moment, Rome's most powerful man, the son of gods, the ruler of an empire, crossed the final threshold between mourning and madness. In the echoing chambers of the Golden House, the emperor's footsteps faded into silence, leaving behind only the smell of burning incense and the faint impression of a woman who no longer existed. Somewhere, in the servants' quarters, a boy slept uneasily, unaware that his face had just been chosen to resurrect a ghost. In the bowels of the imperial palace, the marble no longer gleamed. It sweated. The air was thick with oil and ash, the scent of iron drifting through corridors that once rang with music. A procession of physicians moved like penitents, their torches flickering against frescoed walls depicting Venus and her doves, painted witnesses to a new act of creation that mocked the goddess herself. At the center of this silent ritual stood the emperor, wrapped in dark silk, his expression an unreadable mask of devotion and command. Nero had decided that death would no longer dictate his heart's will. Poppaea Sabina would live again. The boy was brought in quietly, barefoot, his hair washed and combed to a sheen. His name was Sporus, a freedman, neither slave nor citizen, a creature of the margins. He had once served wine in the banquet halls, his delicate features drawing fleeting glances, the kind that vanish before they dare to become thought. Now, those same features had sealed his fate. Someone had whispered of the resemblance, a likeness to the dead empress, a cruel accident that had caught the emperor's eye. Nero approached him with a calm that made the air tremble. "Do not fear," he said softly, his tone that of a priest before sacrifice. "You will not die tonight." Then, after a pause that froze even the torches, he added, "You will become something eternal." The surgeons hesitated. No law of Rome, no ritual of the gods had ever sanctioned such an act. Yet imperial command was law enough. Instruments clinked against bronze trays. The sound was delicate, almost musical, until the meaning of it sank in. Outside the chamber, the palace musicians were told to play. Lyres hummed faintly through the walls, their strings trembling as though in sympathy with the unseen cries within. The operation was brutal, primitive, and deliberate. The body was reduced to symbol, the self to an offering. Blood met marble, and the smell of myrrh could not quite mask the stench of pain. When it was done, Sporus lay still, his breath shallow, his body both living and absent. The emperor did not turn away. He watched, transfixed, as if witnessing a divine resurrection. "She returns to me," Nero whispered more to himself than to anyone else. Days turned into weeks. The boy recovered under heavy silks and heavier silence. Each morning, attendants brought him perfumes once favored by Poppaea, frankincense, rose, and amber, Tailors fitted him with dresses modeled after imperial portraits. A court painter was ordered to capture his likeness beside Nero's own. The resemblance was uncanny, though forced. In the flickering light of oil lamps, Sporus's face became an apparition. He was taught how to speak softly, how to move with the grace of a woman who had once commanded an empire's gaze. And yet, behind the cosmetics and obedience, something human endured. Servants whispered that he rarely slept, that he sat before his bronze mirror until dawn, studying the face that was no longer his. Once, when a slave approached, Sporus murmured, "Tell me, when I speak, do you hear her voice?" The slave said nothing. Silence was the only safety left in that palace. Nero's obsession deepened with every passing night. He began to host private banquets again, small at first, then grander, each one featuring Sporus at his side, veiled in gold-threaded fabric, called by the empress's name. Senators bowed. Soldiers stared at their plates. Rome pretended to believe what it could not bear to name. The culmination came in spring. The emperor announced a wedding. Courtiers gathered in the palace gardens beneath garlands of roses, the same flowers that had once lined Poppaea's funeral bier. The emperor himself wore a veil. Sporus, pale and silent, was dressed as a bride. The ceremony was conducted with full ritual solemnity. A dowry was declared. Vows were spoken. The empire bore witness to a parody of marriage, a union of madness and mastery. As torches lit the night, Nero raised Sporus's hand before the crowd. "Let Rome behold her empress," he proclaimed. Laughter, forced and fragile, rippled through the gathering. In the shadows, one senator muttered, "The gods will not forget this." But no one dared to speak aloud. Later that night, when the festivities dulled into uneasy silence, the emperor's new bride was escorted to the golden chamber once occupied by Poppaea herself. Perfume lingered like a ghost in the air. Nero entered slowly, placing a wreath of violets on the bed. His hand, trembling, brushed Sporus's cheek. "You see," he whispered, "she lives in you. Through you." Sporus did not respond. His eyes were open but far away, reflecting the glint of the imperial ring that marked him as both favored and doomed. Beyond the palace walls, the people of Rome gossiped of their emperor's wedding to a boy, of omens and divine wrath. But within those golden rooms there was only silence, thick, perfumed, and eternal. Outside, the torches guttered in the night wind. Inside, Nero hummed a song Poppaea had once loved. The melody rose and fell like breath. Somewhere between the last note and the dawn, Sporus began to understand that he had not been remade into an empress. He had been hollowed into a monument. And in that hollow silence, between emperor and echo, the empire itself seemed to tremble, as if sensing that this grotesque resurrection was not a miracle at all, but the prelude to ruin. Flames devoured the skyline of Rome like a god's punishment written in fire. From the high terraces of his palace, Nero stood draped in a performer's robe, a golden lyre in his hands, his face illuminated by the inferno below. He sang, not to the people dying in the streets, but to the memory of applause, to the illusion of an audience that no longer existed. And beside him, veiled in silk that shimmered like dying embers, stood Sporus, the boy who had been turned into a woman, the empress of a dream that refused to die. His painted face was motionless, the mask of an idol. The emperor sang, and the empire burned. In the chaos that followed, Rome whispered of curses and omens. The senators fled. Armies mutinied. The praetorians sold loyalty to the highest bidder. Nero, once master of the known world, became a fugitive of his own grandeur. Yet, even as his empire slipped away, he carried Sporus with him, his companion, his reflection, his shadow. Across Greece they traveled, a caravan of exiles and illusions. At each stop, Nero demanded the crowd's cheers. "They still adore me," he said, smiling faintly. but the applause, when it came, sounded hollow, hands clapping for fear, not devotion. At night, in the flicker of campfires, Nero spoke to Sporus as though addressing his lost Poppaea. "Do you remember Delphi?" he would murmur, stroking the boy's hair. "The oracle said my voice would outlive marble." Sporus would nod, not daring to speak. To contradict him was peril. To agree was to share his madness. He had learned silence the way others learned prayer. When the end came, it came not with battle, but with desertion. The guards abandoned their posts. The servants vanished into the hills. Nero, stripped of his titles, became just a man, terrified, aging, and hunted. He hid in a villa outside Rome, clutching his lyre, muttering verses from his own songs. Sporus was there when the emperor received word. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the state. His execution was imminent. Nero turned to him then, eyes red-rimmed but strangely calm. "They will not take me alive," he said. "Even now they conspire to mock me, to strip me and scourge me like a slave." He grasped Sporus's hand, the same hand he had once adorned with jewels. "You will weep for me, won't you? You were always faithful." Sporus could not answer. The emperor smiled, almost tenderly. "You will play her part at my funeral, won't you? Poppaea would not want me to be alone." Then, as dawn bled over the horizon, Nero drove a blade to his throat. His final words, "Qualis artifex pareo," "What an artist dies in me." Silence followed. The empire exhaled. And in that silence, Sporus found himself once more an object, passed from one man's control to another's. The Praetorians, finding him at the villa, spared him as an imperial curiosity. In the months that followed, he became the property of men who had once called Nero a god and now called him a monster. Otho, one of Nero's former companions, took Sporus into his household. The resemblance still captivated him. "You remind me of her," he said one evening, tracing a finger along the edge of Sporus's face. "Perhaps that is why he loved you." But even Otho's affection was a kind of mourning. When he too perished, another man claimed the living relic, the general Vitellius, crude and cruel, who saw in Sporus not beauty but opportunity. It was Vitellius who devised the final humiliation. During a banquet, drunk on victory and wine, he ordered that Sporus be brought forth dressed as Persephone, queen of the underworld. "Let the crowd see the bride of Hades," he laughed. "Let Rome enjoy another wedding." The room erupted in cruel delight. They placed a veil over Sporus's head, handed him a torch, and led him toward the great hall. But this time he refused. Before the mock ceremony could begin, Sporus broke free. Witnesses said he was calm, even serene. He whispered something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse, and vanished into the inner chamber. When they forced the door open moments later, he was gone, having taken his own life rather than endure another man's theater. For a long while, the laughter died. The guests stared at the stillness, at the body of the boy who had been a woman, an empress, a ghost. Vitellius muttered, "He should have lived for Rome's amusement." But the silence that followed was not one of guilt. It was recognition. In that final act, Sporus had done what no emperor could. He had chosen the terms of his end. Years later, when historians recorded the tale, they spoke of Nero's madness, of the fire, of tyranny and decadence. Few spared more than a sentence for the one who had stood beside him through it all. Yet perhaps it was Sporus, not Nero, who truly understood the empire's heart. To be Roman was to perform. To survive was to obey. But to die on one's own terms, quietly, deliberately, was the only act left that could still be called free. And so, as the centuries turned and the marble statues crumbled, his name lingered like a ghost note in the emperor's song, a faint echo of defiance against a world that mistook possession for love.